You don't belong out here. Go back to wherever it is people like you come from.
I was born here. I have every right to be standing on this beach.
The security footage from the Oceanfront Hotel on Atlantic Avenue would later be entered into federal court as Exhibit A. It showed, without ambiguity, everything that happened at 8:47 that Sunday morning on Virginia Beach. A black man stood knee-deep in the gentle Atlantic surf, a fishing rod in one hand, his other resting on the shoulder of his young daughter. He wore faded board shorts and an old Army t-shirt, salt-worn and sun-bleached from years of mornings exactly like this one. Nothing about the scene suggested urgency, nothing suggested threat. And yet 2 plainclothed federal agents were already moving down the boardwalk steps toward him, badges catching the early light, eyes fixed with a certainty that had no evidence to support it. What those agents could not have known, what nobody standing on that beach could have known, was that the quiet man in the surf was about to dismantle their careers, expose a pattern of misconduct buried for years inside one of the most powerful federal agencies in the country, and walk away with the largest wrongful detention verdict ever recorded against ICE in United States history. The hotel cameras were rolling, the phones were coming out, and everything was about to change. If you are ready to see institutional racism taken down, like this video and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. And if this is your first time here, hit that subscribe button right now, because you won't want to miss tomorrow's story of cops messing with the wrong people and finding out. Let me know if you enjoyed the story. Let's continue. Dr. George Blacksmith had been a marine biologist for nearly 2 decades. Before that, he had spent 14 years in the United States Army, including 2 overseas deployments that took him from the deserts of the Middle East to the port cities of the Pacific Rim. He held a PhD in marine ecology from the University of Virginia, had authored more than 80 peer-reviewed papers on Atlantic coastal ecosystems, and served as a senior research fellow at UVA's Department of Environmental Sciences. He had briefed members of Congress on marine conservation policy. He had consulted with the Department of Homeland Security on environmental risk frameworks along the eastern seaboard. He knew federal law not as an abstraction, but as a working document he had spent years helping to shape. He knew his constitutional rights with the same precision he applied to water column data, and he recognized exactly when those rights were being ignored. That Sunday morning, George Blacksmith had one goal: catch breakfast with his daughter before the beach crowds arrived. He had risen before 6, packed his gear, and driven the familiar 12 minutes from his home in Norfolk to his preferred stretch of shoreline on Virginia Beach, the same stretch where his own father had taught him to cast a line when he was barely older than Ava was. Now, the morning was still and warm, the Atlantic cooperative, the kind of late summer day that asked nothing of anyone. Ava, 11 years old and already developing her father's quiet patience, stood beside him in the shallows, her small hands gripping the rod with the focused concentration she brought to everything she cared about. 2 striped bass rested in the bucket between them. They had been out there for nearly 2 hours, trading jokes that only made sense to the 2 of them, the rest of the world entirely absent. What Blacksmith did not know, as he reached over to correct the angle of Ava's cast, was that this ordinary morning would become the centerpiece of a federal civil rights case, the subject of a congressional briefing, and the most watched piece of citizen film footage in Virginia that year. Agents Victor Henry and Jonathan Smith were already on the boardwalk. They had come down the steps with the unmistakable body language of men who had already made a decision, shoulders forward, pace deliberate, eyes fixed on a single point in the surf. Henry was closer to the waterline, his right hand resting at his hip near his holster, with the casual readiness of someone who had practiced that posture until it became reflex. Smith positioned himself wider, scanning the surrounding beach with the exaggerated vigilance of a man performing surveillance rather than conducting it. Their badges were already visible, no announcement. No greeting, just the geometry of an approach that communicated authority before a single word was spoken. 20 yards away, a white family of 4 stood at the waterline with their own fishing rods. The agents walked past them without a glance. Blacksmith noticed the shift in the air before he heard anything, the way the small sounds of the beach rearranged themselves, Ava's laughter falling quiet as she tracked her father's gaze. He turned. He took them in. He read the situation with the same calibrated calm he brought to a field data collection and began reeling in his line. He waded toward shore unhurried, keeping Ava tucked close behind him, and met the agents at the water's edge with a steady nod. Henry spoke without identifying himself by name, demanding to see identification and verify immigration status. The words were blunt and unsequenced. No preamble, no probable cause offered, no acknowledgement of the child standing 3 feet away. Blacksmith reached into the waterproof pouch, clipped to his shorts, and produced his Virginia driver's license. He held it out and stated clearly that he was a United States citizen, born in Richmond, that he had been fishing this coastline since childhood, and that he was not aware of any lawful basis for the inquiry. His voice did not waver. It was the voice of a man who had given briefings in federal buildings, who had testified in front of committees, who understood that composure under pressure was not merely a personal virtue, but, in moments like this one, a strategic necessity. Henry glanced at the license and handed it back without comment. The questioning continued. Henry asked why Blacksmith was in this particular area, as though the presence of a black man at a public beach required geographic justification. Smith had moved around to Blacksmith's left, creating a loose enclosure. The agents then demanded access to the tackle box resting on the sand and the waterproof bag sitting beside it. Blacksmith's response was immediate and precise. He did not consent to any search. He cited the Fourth Amendment. He cited the absence of a warrant and the absence of exigent circumstance. He stated each point without aggression, without volume, in the measured cadence of someone who had memorized the legal framework, not to impress anyone, but because he had always known, somewhere in the long accumulated experience of being a black man in America, that he might one day need it on a beach in front of his daughter. Ava pressed closer to his arm. Her grip tightened. Around them, the morning had changed. Beachgoers who had been jogging or sitting quietly on towels had slowed. A cluster of people near the boardwalk steps had stopped entirely. Phones were appearing, not yet raised, but held, ready. The tableau in the surf had the quality of a scene that everyone present recognized, even if no one could yet name exactly what was unfolding. Henry did not wait. He moved to the tackle box and upended it onto the wet sand. Lures scattered. Hooks caught the light. A carefully labeled, sealed vial of seawater collected that very morning. The final sample in a data set that had taken Blacksmith 14 months to compile rolled to the edge of the surf and stopped. Smith stepped forward and closed his hand around Blacksmith's wrist. The handcuffs came out. The sound they made as they locked around Blacksmith's wrists behind his back was small and mechanical and final. He did not resist. He did not move except to turn his face slightly toward Ava, as though he could communicate steadiness to her through eye contact alone. In a voice that remained even, he stated aloud that he was not resisting, that he was complying under protest, and that he was invoking his right to remain silent. Ava screamed. The sound cut across the beach with the particular, uncontainable quality of a child's terror, raw and immediate, and impossible to contextualize into procedure. She screamed for her father. She screamed a question that no child should have to ask at 11 years old on a Sunday morning in the middle of an ordinary fishing trip. She grabbed his leg with both hands, her face pressed against his hip, and the crowd that had been quietly watching absorbed the sound and held it. Phones came up. Henry radioed for transport and logged the incident as non-cooperation. The fishing rod had drifted 6 feet into the surf. The scattered lures lay in the wet sand. The sealed vial of water samples, evidence from a study that Blacksmith was scheduled to present to ICE headquarters in 4 days, rested at the edge of the tide. The hotel camera on Atlantic Avenue recorded all of it. So did 11 cell phones, from 11 different angles, capturing the father standing in handcuffs in the surf while his daughter wept against his leg, and 2 federal agents who had not yet begun to understand what they had done. The unmarked SUV pulled to the curb on Atlantic Avenue 18 minutes after Henry's radio call, and Supervisory Agent Robert Klein stepped out into a scene that stopped him mid-stride. The crowd numbered more than 15 now beachgoers, joggers, a pair of hotel guests still in robes who had come down from an upper-floor balcony when the noise reached them. Most had their phones raised. Blacksmith stood at the waterline, wrists still cuffed behind him, his posture unbowed. Ava pressed against his side with her face turned away from the agents. The scattered tackle box contents lay in the sand like an inventory of a search that had never found anything because there had never been anything to find. Klein took in the child. He took in the cameras. He took in Henry and Smith standing at the periphery of the crowd with the particular rigidity of men who were beginning to understand that something had gone profoundly wrong. He went to his agents first. The conversation was brief and visibly unsatisfying for everyone involved. Henry and Smith reported that they had approached on the basis of suspicious presence, no prior intelligence, no complaint, no articulable basis beyond a judgment call made from the top of a boardwalk staircase. Klein listened without expression, then turned and walked toward the water. He approached Blacksmith directly, and what followed was a conversation that the surrounding witnesses could not hear in full, but could read entirely in the quality of Klein's stillness. Blacksmith spoke with the unhurried precision of a man who had been trained to deliver information under adverse conditions 14 years in the Army, a career built on presenting complex data to audiences who held significant institutional power. He named his institution, he named his credentials. He described the contents of the scattered vial in the sand. He outlined, factually and without editorial, the sequence of events that had led to the handcuffs currently on his wrists. And then he mentioned Tuesday. Klein's expression did not change, but something behind his eyes did. He turned and issued a single directive to Henry and Smith. The handcuffs came off. Blacksmith brought his hands forward slowly, rubbed his wrists once, and folded Ava into his arms with a steadiness that the crowd around them watched in silence. She held on. He held on. The murmur that moved through the onlookers was not loud, but it carried the particular weight of collective recognition, the sound a crowd makes when it has witnessed something it will not easily forget. If you think federal agents should never be able to handcuff a father in front of his young daughter without cause, type unfair in the comments right now. And if you know another parent who needs to hear the story, share it with them before you keep watching. What Klein had just learned, and what Henry and Smith were now learning in real time from the expression on their supervisor's face, was that Dr. George Blacksmith was not simply a private citizen who had been wrongfully detained on a Sunday morning. He was the lead researcher on a $47 million Department of Homeland Security funded study examining racial bias in federal immigration enforcement patterns along the eastern seaboard. The study had been 18 months in development. Its findings were already being reviewed by senior DHS officials, and its formal presentation to ICE headquarters in Washington was scheduled for the following Tuesday morning. The sealed vial that Henry had sent, rolling toward the Atlantic surf, was the final field sample in that study's dataset, collected that very morning from these exact waters. In what had been until 8:47, a quiet and unremarkable research trip that doubled as a Sunday ritual with his daughter. The agents had detained the expert, they had scattered the evidence, they had done it in front of cameras, and the report they had interrupted was specifically designed to prevent federal agents from doing exactly what they had just done. The silence between the three agents lasted several seconds. Klein demanded badge numbers. He began an on-scene incident log that both Henry and Smith would later describe separately as the moment they understood the magnitude of what had occurred. Nearby, Blacksmith moved with the efficient calm of a man who had shifted from father to documentarian, photographing the scattered gear, the sand where the tackle box had been upended, the faces of the nearest witnesses. He requested names and contact information from bystanders who offered it willingly, a small informal network of corroboration assembling itself on a public beach on a Sunday morning. He stated, clearly enough for those nearby to hear, that he would be filing a Freedom of Information Act request for all body camera footage and written incident reports within 24 hours. What the crowd watching him did not fully know, what even Klein, in those first minutes, did not entirely grasp, was the depth of the record Blacksmith had been quietly building long before that morning. His research into ICE enforcement patterns along non-border coastal zones had been accumulating for years, cross-referenced against demographic data, incident reports obtained through prior FOIA requests, and the testimony of individuals across 6 states who had contacted his university research office after finding his published work. The study DHS had funded was not the beginning of his documentation. It was the culmination of it. The men who had handcuffed him on this beach had not interrupted an isolated fishing trip. They had handed him the single most powerful first-person data point in his entire body of research. By the time Blacksmith buckled Ava into the passenger seat of his truck and pulled out of the beach parking lot, the first video had already cleared 100,000 views. His civil rights attorney's phone rang on the drive home. The attorney listened for 4 minutes without interrupting, then spoke for 2. The case had begun. The videos did not fade. That was the first thing the ICE Public Affairs Office discovered when the footage began circulating on the evening of the arrest, that the clips were not behaving the way isolated incidents sometimes did, trending briefly before disappearing into the archive of collective attention. These stayed, they spread. They were clipped and reposted and stitched together into longer compilations that showed the full sequence: the approach, the demand for papers, the upended tackle box, the handcuffs, and Ava's face. That face 11 years old, pressed against her father's leg, Her fishing hat still on became the image that editorial boards wrote about and that congressional offices cited in their statements within the first 48 hours. By Monday morning, the story had a name across every major national outlet: the marine biologist arrested while fishing with his daughter. By Monday afternoon, the ICE Office of Professional Responsibility had opened a formal internal review. By Tuesday, the day Blacksmith had been scheduled to present his research to ICE headquarters in Washington, the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division had initiated a parallel investigation. The irony of the timing was not lost on anyone. The briefing was rescheduled. The study's findings, now accompanied by a first-person account of the precise enforcement failure it had been designed to address, carried a weight in those federal corridors that no abstract data set could have generated on its own. Investigative journalists reached the complaint records within the first week. What they found there transformed the story from an incident into a pattern. Victor Henry carried 11 prior complaints in his personnel file, filed across a span of 6 years, nearly all of them involving Black or Latino men stopped in non-border zones with no articulable suspicion. Jonathan Smith carried 6. Both files showed the same institutional response to each complaint: reviewed, noted, and closed without meaningful disciplinary action. The records had not been hidden exactly, they existed in the system, but they had been processed with the particular efficiency of a bureaucracy that had learned to absorb accountability without being changed by it. The journalist published the files in full. Public pressure did not dissipate, it organized. 14 months after the arrest, the criminal trial opened in the Eastern District of Virginia. The prosecution's evidence was, by the standards of federal civil rights cases, unusually complete. There was hotel security footage. There were 11 cell phone videos from 11 separate witnesses, each capturing a different angle of the same sequence of events. There was Ava's recorded 911 call, placed from her father's phone while he was still in handcuffs, her voice steady in the way that children sometimes become steady in crisis, describing what was happening to her father in factual terms that the jury would later describe in post-verdict interviews as the single most affecting piece of testimony in the entire proceeding. There was expert analysis from 2 constitutional law scholars on the absence of any lawful basis for the stop, the search, or the detention. And there was the report itself, $47 million of federal research, peer-reviewed and DHS commissioned, with a data set whose final sample had been scattered across a public beach by one of the agents now seated at the defense table. The verdicts came back guilty on all counts: deprivation of rights under color of law, false arrest, and illegal search and seizure. Henry received 16 months in federal prison and a lifetime ban from any law enforcement position in the United States. Smith received 13 months with the same permanent prohibition. Both sentences were handed down in a courtroom that held, in the gallery, the families of individuals named in the prior complaint records, people who had filed reports years earlier that had gone nowhere, who had driven to Richmond from across the state to sit in the wooden seats and watch the verdict read aloud. The civil litigation moved on a parallel track under 42 United States Code, Section 1983, and the jury's calculus there was different in character but identical in direction. The damages framework accounted for the emotional distress sustained by both Blacksmith and Ava, whose therapist testified at length about the disruption to her sense of safety in public spaces, particularly near water. In the months following the arrest, it accounted for the professional disruption to Blacksmith's federal consulting relationships, several of which had been placed on administrative hold during the criminal proceedings at the request of cautious agency legal teams. And it accounted for the documented pattern of misconduct across both agents' careers, the years of buried complaints, the absence of institutional correction, the systemic failure that had made this particular Sunday morning not an anomaly but an inevitability. The jury awarded $13,900,000, the largest verdict ever returned against ICE for wrongful detention in the history of the agency. The compensatory portion addressed the measurable harm. The punitive portion addressed something larger: the institutional culture that had allowed Henry and Smith to accumulate 17 combined complaints without consequence, and the message that culture had sent to every agent who had ever watched those complaints disappear into a filing system and understood what that disappearance meant. The consent decree came 60 days after the civil verdict. The entire Virginia Beach ICE field office was placed under a 5-year federal oversight agreement that mandated revised stop and contact protocols, mandatory implicit bias training reviewed by an independent panel, civilian oversight of complaint review processes, statistical auditing of all pedestrian and field stops with demographic breakdowns published quarterly, and body camera requirements for every field interaction. 14 additional agents within the office were investigated in conjunction with the proceedings. Several were terminated. Several were reassigned to administrative roles with no field authority. 3 supervisors, including a senior official who had reviewed and closed 4 of Henry's prior complaints, were formally disciplined, with 2 facing demotion. The reform documents that came out of the consent decree process cited Blacksmith's research by name. The study he had been preparing to present on the Tuesday after his arrest was formally incorporated into the revised training curriculum for the agency's Eastern Regional offices. The irony had completed its circuit. The report commissioned to fix the problem had been disrupted by the problem, and the disruption had ultimately guaranteed that the report's findings would carry more institutional force than they ever could have on their own merits. George Blacksmith returned to his laboratory at the University of Virginia in the fall following the trial. He returned to the Atlantic coast on the first Sunday after his schedule allowed it, and Ava went with him, the same hat, the same rods, the same stretch of shore on Virginia Beach. She had testified at the civil trial in a recorded deposition that was played for the jury rather than delivered in person at the recommendation of her therapist, and the composure she had shown in that recording, the careful, factual account of what she had seen and felt and understood on that Sunday morning, had been cited by the plaintiff's lead attorney as the moment the jury's direction became irreversible. She was 12 by the time the verdict was read. She cast her line into the Atlantic with the same focused grip her father had been teaching her since she was small, and she reeled in a striped bass before the morning was an hour old. He took a photograph of her holding it, the water behind her calm and bright, and said nothing that needed to be said. Victor Henry served his sentence in a federal correctional facility in West Virginia. His pension was forfeited. His marriage ended before the criminal trial concluded. Jonathan Smith served his sentence at a different facility and emerged to find that the lifetime law enforcement ban extended, by virtue of the civil settlement's terms, to any federally contracted security role. The careers they had spent years building were not suspended or interrupted. They were finished, completely and permanently, by a decision made at the top of a boardwalk staircase on a Sunday morning when a black father was standing in the Atlantic surf with his daughter. The lesson that Blacksmith had always understood, and that Ava was learning in the way that children learn the things that matter most, not from instruction, but from witness, was not that power protects the powerful. It was that truth, documented and asserted and held steady under pressure, has a weight that institutional authority consistently underestimates. The quiet man fishing with his daughter had not been an easy target. He had been a researcher, a veteran, a father who knew his rights and stated them plainly in front of his child, in front of a crowd, in front of cameras, without flinching. The record he left behind was not a complaint, it was a curriculum. And every federal agent trained on the revised protocols that emerged from his case would learn, before their first field assignment, what happened when the system chose the wrong Sunday morning to make its mistake.
If you like this video, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss the next story. Share this video with someone who would appreciate it, and let's keep building this community together. And before you go, drop a comment below. I'd love to hear your thoughts on what stood out to you the most. Until next time, stay safe, stay curious, and I'll see you in the next.